George Bush, George Burns, George Jones, George Benson, George C. Scott, George Reeves, George Wallace, George Hallis, George Washington Carver, George Jefferson, George Jetson, George Peppard, George Harrison. Boy George, by George, George of the jungle, George Strait, Chris George, Linda Day George Patton, Phyllis George Custer, George McClellan, George Foster, George Martin, George Thorogood, George Carlin, George Hamilton, George Raff, George Jessel, Tallulah Gorge, Susan George, Curious Georgie Porgy, George Clinton, George Siegel, George McGovern, Jeb George Lindsay, George Sanford Brown, George Lucas, George McRae, George Schultz, George Mikan, Gorgeous George Jr., everybody, George Orwell, George Wimp, Newt Gingrich, George Goebel, George Michael, George Foreman, Chuck George, a guy I used to go to high school with, Georgetown, George Naismith, George Will, George Montgomery, George Steinbrenner, Georgie Fame, George from Mice and Men, George Allen, George Rogers, George Gipp the Gipper, George Gershwin, George Gervin, Machine Gun Kelly, his name was George Zaharias, George Kennedy, George Brett, George Mitchell, George Stephanopoulos, Chief Dan George Blended, George Plimpton, George McGinnis, George Rogers Clark, George Bernard Shaw, George Seifert, Eddie George the Animal Steel, and for all you party animals, George Deco. And George is on my mind.